life of anyone who takes another person's life. Whoever kills a human being will be killed by a human being, because God has made humans in his own image.
Saying this would be a special treat. Appreciate your confidence. Let's go. Is it on? Okay. This used to have a belt clip on it, I thought. Okay. If you're visiting, let me say that I'm not the usual preacher. And if you're visiting, you might want to give us another chance. Okay. I'm trying to think of a quote of Winnie the Pooh. He said something like, "A thought is one thing when it's in your head, but when it's out in the open for everybody to see it, it seems like something else." I'm looking at the title of this that I chose for this sermon. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, that looks awfully provocative. A lot of people have strong ideas already on the application of Scripture to government. I don't want to upset anybody, and I don't want to be provocative. I want to, in fact, I'm going to draw some conclusions that maybe you've never heard before, because I've never heard them before, which makes me a little cautious in how I present it, because I don't want to say anything wrong. I don't want to say anything that's going to cause anybody any problems. And so I'll do it with all the humility I can muster. The thing that made me choose this topic may not be what you think. It's not the coming up election. Well, actually, the current election is more of a kind of a month-long event, isn't it? But the deadline is in 2 days. No, the reason I chose this topic is because we're doing a class on Romans 13. We're doing a class on Romans in the mornings, and the handful of people who know me really well know that Romans 13 has been sort of, you might call it a hobby of mine for the last 20, 30 years. So I looked ahead into the study guide to see what the commentator had to say about Romans 13, and it looks like pretty much the same thing that I've been told about Romans 13 all my life, which I wouldn't say it's completely wrong, but I think it misses the point, and it's not completely correct either. So I talked to Buck about that, and he assured me this would not be your father's your father's Romans 13 class. It's going to be different. So I'll let Buck teach Romans 13. I'm not going to teach on Romans 13, although I might quote a few scriptures. But rather, prior to understanding Romans 13 properly, and so as not to miss the point, I think it's important to understand, to have some prerequisite knowledge before we enter Romans 13. So knowing that the day is going to come, not too far from now, I thought I would take this opportunity to lay some groundwork for a far-off Bible class we're going to have in the Sunday morning. Far off, I don't mean years, but I mean maybe a few weeks or months. Okay, and one thing about sermons is when I prepare a sermon, deliver a sermon, I don't think of it as I've been given authority to tell you what to think, but rather my approach is that I study the scriptures and understand them the best I can, and then I present to you what I think I found, and it's up to you to evaluate what I present and to make your own application. I can make some suggestions, some general suggestions for application, but you're the one that has to live your life. Nobody's going to live your life. I'm not going to live your life, so you're going to have to actually make the application yourself. Okay, then, the first thing we have to understand, I'll try to adjust this down a little bit. First thing we have to understand before we go into Romans 13 is we have to develop a theory of government. Why is Paul even talking about whatever he's talking about in Romans 13? He's talking about the higher power and avenging evil and so on. What's he talking about? Where did that come from? Well, it didn't start in Romans 13. I'd suggest that it started back in Genesis, chapter 1. We can turn there. You know what? I didn't mark what time I started. Buck told me not to take 3 hours like he does. So I don't know how. I'm going to try to budget my time and decide how many scriptures to read. In Romans chapter, sorry, I got that on my mind, don't I? Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky." Verse 27. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So that kind of sets the tone for all of human existence and for how we understand the rest of the Bible. As so many things in Genesis do, being the book of beginnings. As a young Christian, I remember going back, I would think of this meaning, well, that means that by God's image, what he means is that of all of creation, he has finally made the pinnacle of his creation, in fact, the whole purpose of his creation. Everything else was preliminary unto this step to create man in his image. And that was so that God could have a relationship with part of his creation, and a relationship deep enough so that whereas God loved us, this part of the creation can reciprocate that love and love him too. And that's true, but that's as far as I went for many years. But I think it's a little more than that. That is part of it, but that leads to other application too. God told us to subdue the earth. I looked up the word subdue to see if I had the right idea. I think of subdue, the only thing you subdue is something that's trying to get away, but I don't think that's the point in this case. In this case, the subduing of the earth, I think what he means is taking ownership of it. And of course, no individual is going to own the whole earth. And on the other hand, everybody is not going to own the whole earth either. But he says to be fruitful and multiply, and he talks about that as a means to the end of subduing the earth. So everybody's going to be able, according to whatever opportunities and whatever abilities he has, and he's going to use those to take opportunity to take possession of some part of the earth. It doesn't have to be the ground necessarily. It could be something that's mobile, that came out of the ground, like the potter and the clay. The potter and the clay is a recurrent example of a creator and his creation, and God compares it to himself even. But as far as ownership goes, when Abraham dug a well, he conceived an idea in his head. There was a need. He needed a reliable source of water, not only for people, but for his livestock. So he took the opportunity to dig a hole in the ground so that the water would collect, the underground water would collect in that hole in the ground. Well, I don't have to explain what a well is to you. So Abraham built a well. He conceived of it. He put he imposed his idea upon the ground, and the ground could not resist him. He overpowered the ground, and he imposed his will upon the ground. And thereby, by attaching his idea to the ground, it didn't cease to be his own, but rather the ground the well is in became his too. That's why the scripture refers to it from then on as Abraham's well, because it belonged to him. And as I mentioned, the potter and the clay, the potter imposes his will upon the clay and forces it to do something that it was not otherwise inclined to do. And he makes a pitcher. So that way he can, again, collect water in it, but he doesn't have to drink it at the well. He can put water in his pitcher or other container and take it home with him. And he can drink it when it's more convenient. In other words, as far as bearing God's image, well, what sort of behavior had God exemplified up until this point in Genesis? Up until this point, he spent the whole time creating. Creating involved not only creating the matter, but when he did, he imposed order upon the matter. He caused it to become organized, such that when God created man, we're not floating out in space, unable to breathe. He created the universe, to create the solar system, to create the earth for us to live upon. But he didn't create it to feed us. He gave us instruction, you too, bearing my image, now you continue creating order and force the earth to support your life. So God creates order that supports human life, and likewise we create order that supports human life. And that's also bearing God's image. It's more than reciprocating God's love. Part of the way we reciprocate God's love is bearing his image, creating order, and supporting human life. Oh, I see, you'll see under section 2 and subsection B, I started to write an equation. Ability plus authority equals a mystery sum. The reason I didn't fill it in is because I ran out of space, because that margin in the middle is as far as I could go. And Gmail, that's the only way. Anyway, so if you don't do anything else with this outline, at least finish that equation, please. And the sum is agency. Ability plus authority equals agency. Now that you've completed my outline, you can do whatever you want with it. You can throw it away like every other outline, whatever. If I think of that equation being unfinished, I won't be able to sleep at night. So be sure to finish that. So God gives us human life, he gives human beings life, and he gives us agency as well. And agency is, when I use the word agency, I'm talking about the authority from God and nobody else to take action, to subdue the earth. Okay, I could spend. This is a topic that has filled volumes of literature. I could spend a lot of time on this, and I'm getting bogged down. I'm going to be approaching that 3-hour limit. So God has created us to bear his image. And this I don't have to spend much time on. We all know that it didn't work out as God planned, as God intended, or at least as God intended for it to work. He intended for us to rule the earth. Does that mean we displace God as the ruler of the earth? No, that means God is still ruler. He means for us to be co-rulers alongside him, co-regency, and that again is another facet of the closeness of the relationship that we have with our Creator. Okay, so as I already said, that didn't work out. Instead of bearing God's image, after the fall in the garden, and then after the first murder, Cain killed his brother, and then following that, Lamech killed somebody, and Lamech had some rationalization for it. He said, well, Cain just killed his brother because he was angry. I killed somebody because he injured me. So at least I had a better reason than Cain. So therefore, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, then I'm avenged 77-fold for anybody who tries to avenge that murder. So there's not a lot of detail in these events, but I think the overall picture is that the snowball has started with these two murders, and it's going downhill and creating an avalanche. And eventually, everybody, everywhere, instead of bearing God's image, has become an animal and has shed God's image. And the whole reason that God created the universe and the world is to give us a setting to have a relationship with him. And that's not what was occurring. People were killing one another and stealing from one another, and it got to the point where it undermined, if you design a machine to perform a task, and instead of performing a task, that machine does the opposite and undoes the task, how long are you going to put up with that machine? You're going to turn it off, right? Okay, so God created man for a purpose, and it totally went the opposite direction. So God said, okay, we're going to have to start over again. And I'm glossing over this because this is another discussion that people have filled volumes with. But the point is that God had to reboot sort of creation, so to speak. But it's a very, very dark event in the history of mankind. You imagine all the people you used to see, and then 40 days later, there's a cataclysm, and nobody's around anymore except for the 8 people you were with. Okay. Jumping ahead. So just to point out, that was a dark event. The flood was. That was very serious. You heard the word serious as a heart attack. That's an understatement. So following that, in the wake of that dark tale, there's a new authority that God gives to man that didn't exist before this point. In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 5, as Andy is reading that, I'm thinking, wow, that's really dark. Dark way to start a sermon. He says, surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. From every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So this is not the first time you've seen this verse, but maybe I can make some new applications. So he emphasizes, I think twice, he mentions in God's image he made man. That is the reason for this. When a murderer murders his victim, he snuffed out his life, and by so doing, he just destroyed the image of God in that person, right? But let me suggest, this is a double-edged sword that cuts both ways. Before he does that, or as he commits that murder, he has divested himself of God's image, because God does not support death. God supports life. So not only has he destroyed God's image in his victim, he's destroyed it in himself as well. So that when man sheds that man's blood, he's not harming the image of God. That was already done in that man. He did it himself. What's happening is you're shedding the blood of an animal at that point. And instead of destroying God's image, that's preserving God's image. Now, this is a dark, and this is about as dark as it's going to get. Although it's not going to get much brighter. So he talks about the image of God. So life is the ultimate. Life, the rest of the image of God depends on that human life. But in emphasizing God's image, I think this authority extends somewhat beyond life into preserving God's image. Or in other words, even if a person isn't killed completely, if a person damages God's image in that person, he's going to have to fix it by paying with a bit of his own image of God. So, in other words, if a person destroys somebody else's property, he should be compelled to replace that property. Nobody comes out ahead in this, but it's just this is just a concept of justice. I'll use that word. That depends on the understanding of God's image. So again, God's image sets the tone. It sets the tone for our existence here on earth, and it sets the tone for how we understand the rest of the Bible, like Romans 13. Okay, then let's do some further analysis without moving on, but staying in this passage. To whom is God speaking here in Romans 9? Well, he's You could say he's speaking to the 8 people who came out of the ark. I think that's the immediate answer that comes to mind. But consider this. Not only is he speaking to those 8 people, he's speaking to every living person on earth at the same time. So in other words, he's addressing the world's population. And not only is he addressing the world's population at the time, he's speaking to every one of our ancestors. Everybody here is descended from those 8 people in some combination. So he's addressing us as well. I think he was addressing us when he said to subdue the earth, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And he's still speaking to us, the descendants of these 8 people. Was he addressing those 8 people? Yes, he was. But he didn't expect that this authority was going to be exercised anytime soon, or even in that generation. I think that's why he says in verse 7, as for you, you 8, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. So all that to say that I think these 2 verses, verse 5 and 6 in chapter 9, apply to us. And not only do they apply to us, but that is the foundation for a theory of government at all. There is no authority for a human being from God. There's no authority for a human being to harm another human being unless it's in this context. And this authority does not kick in until evil has been done. You can't exercise this authority to shed man's blood anticipating he's going to do evil. You have to wait until it's done. So, and speaking of not to individuals, if you remember in Romans chapter 12, leading up to Romans 13, toward the end of chapter 12, he says, brethren, do not take your own revenge. If someone does you evil, leave room for the wrath of God. So somehow, and Lamech, when he supposedly avenged the injury done to him, he did it. He was the victim, and the victim lashed out himself against the person who supposedly victimized him. Individual victims are not to carry out the vengeance. It has to be the collective body of the people who does it. How is that done? Well, this is one of those occasions when God gives us a command, commanding a result, without explaining to us how the means by which to achieve that result. And that's not the first time God has done that. It's not the only time God does that. Sometimes we just have to come to the terms with the fact that the Bible is not a rule book. The Bible is something to teach us about God. And oftentimes, He expects us to use our own intellect, our own creativity, to come up with a means of achieving the ends that He commands. Let me give you a more concrete example. After all, I've included the scripture in the outline. I might as well explain why it's there. In Leviticus chapter 3 and verse 22, as the people, the Israelites, are going into the promised land, God spends a lot of ink and paper explaining how it's going to be and how it should be when they enter the land. One thing He says to them is, when you harvest your fields, don't harvest the corners. Leave that to the needy people so that they'll have something to live on. So that sounds pretty straightforward when you read it, but when you do it, and you start coming to the corner, and you're thinking, oh, how big should I make this corner? I could start here, or I could make it way up there. So in other words, God didn't tell him. He told him to save the corners for the poor people, but He still didn't tell him how much to save, did He? They had to figure it out themselves, based on the information they had and based on what they understood about God. So likewise, God tells us as a whole, as a population, as a society, as a country, or as a community, you people collectively have to make sure that crimes are avenged. But the victim of the crime is not to lash out and do it himself. So how are we going to do this? Well, through history, we've seen variations on how people do it. But jumping ahead, I only have a few minutes left. So I want to emphasize the main points. The image of God, man shedding man's blood, and now this is the third one, the third leg of the stool. is the expedient way this is carried out. An example in the New Testament by the Roman society described by Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13. Where did I put 1 Peter anyway? There it is. Now, again, this is a scripture we've all read many, many times, innumerable times. Maybe I can point out something different from what we've seen before. 1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. By the way, I looked up the word governors, and reading the definition, it sounded like it was, to me, it was describing police is what it was describing. So compare it to a sheriff and his deputies, I would say, would be a parallel for modern times. Let me point out here, okay, it uses the word translated institution. In the Greek is the word ktisis. Usually when that word appears in the Greek text, the translators translate it as creation. If you look up the word ktisis, you'll see the word, it's translated as creation. But for some reason, the translators translate it as institution in verse 13. And I think most people come away with that interpreting that in turn as a law. It's not saying obey the laws, it's saying obey the creations of men. And it's saying that kings and governors or sheriffs and their deputies are creations of men. So in other words, the way this authority in Romans chapter 9, verses 5 and 6 is executed is that the community creates, out of nothing, it creates an office of authority to avenge evil. And a worthy person is chosen from among the population or a group of people. A body of people is chosen with such a structure so as to carry out this command that the entire society is responsible for, the execution of justice, the shedding of man's blood. That authority of the people is concentrated into this office. Let's say it's a sheriff. And he has the authority when a crime occurs and he hears about it. He needs to find out who did it and then execute the proper judgment. I'm simplifying, of course. I'm simplifying all these main points. All of these main points could fill volumes. And so I may be creating more questions than answers. I don't know. Hope not. Hope I'm giving you something new to work with. So to sum up, Peter refers to these human creations, that is, he refers to kings and governors or sheriffs and deputies as creations of men. And he commands the submission to them, not generally, not as a blank check for authority, all authority for these people, but rather he's commanding specific obedience or submission, and that is for the purpose of avenging evil. So there's a place for government, and it's not whatever you can think of. It's not the sky's the limit. It's God intends. The only purpose for man to shed man's blood is for avenging evil, and the authority of government is limited to that. That's why he says, submit for the purpose of avenging evil. None, I don't know about you. As I said, I'm just presenting my conclusions to you. That doesn't mean that I'm binding this on you, because I don't have authority to bind this on you. You have to evaluate this for yourself, and see if I'm making the right conclusions. Maybe you have different conclusions. Maybe you can enlighten me. I don't know. But I acknowledge that this is really different. This really changed my view of government when I looked at this. Okay. So I don't think I've cited anything in Romans 13 yet, have I? I may yet. I've only got a couple minutes. Actually, my time is up. Okay, so I'm not going to get all the way through the end of this. I'll say a couple more things in conclusion. One thing, if you want me to fill you out on the rest of this outline, you can come to me after the sermon. I don't want to keep you too long, like some preachers do. Not Bach, but I have some preachers. Anyway, I don't want to be one of those guys, you know. So, as I said, the people create the office of authority to avenge evil. Whatever you want to call it, and however you want to structure it so it stays within its realm of authority and doesn't become abused and doesn't go off in any other direction. God doesn't specify that. He leaves it up to us to do the best we can as far as organizing that. But we are responsible for avenging evil. Everyone here collectively is responsible. So it might behoove us to have some influence on how the government is run, might it not? And there are ways to do that. One is by knowing what the scriptures say. Another one is by dialoguing with people and enlightening other people. You can also enlighten your representatives in the government by writing them letters. I've often been told that nothing is more persuasive than a handwritten letter rather than a phone call, voicemail, or an email. A handwritten letter apparently is very persuasive if you were to do that. Explaining to them what their job is. Voting is just one of the many. I think, based on Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, I feel compelled to vote for that reason. But listening to this lesson, it may not have much to do with with what we're hearing on the news right now. I understand that. There are ways to flesh this out, which I won't get into. And let me also, and along those lines, that as the sheriff is a creation of men, therefore the society as a whole is a higher authority than the government, because the people created the government. The creature is never greater than its creator. The people created the government is subordinate to the people. The only time a person is subject to the government is when he is staying out of the way and allowing the government to avenge evil. The victim doesn't do it for himself, and nobody else does it. No other individual does it. You have to do it this way. And one more thing, I'll end on this, that this image of God is codified in U.S. law because it's in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, where it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." Okay, this is different terminology than I use because this is coming from a different direction, because this is coming from the study of history and dialogue with fellow people. Anyway, but obviously human life is the beginning of God's image. And he talks about liberty. Liberty is an absence of restriction, which describes the agency that God gives us. The point being that we shouldn't be intimidated as Christians from enlightening government and trying to direct how government behaves and how government works and what it does. We're on very solid ground with that. That is, I would say that the Declaration is the most authoritative document in U.S. law. And I think some lawyers would disagree with me on that and say that the Constitution is. But I would say the Constitution gets all of its authority from the Declaration, and therefore the Constitution cannot contradict the Declaration. So however we understand the Constitution has to be in accordance with the Declaration. And the Declaration is what establishes the biblical image of God as the basis of all law. So for that reason, we shouldn't be intimidated. And for another reason is a government without God's direction is a wild animal. That's something that's uncontrollable. The way you control a government is by understanding that it has its limits, and that's established by its creator and the people are established by the creator of all things. So we are on solid ground as far as law, as far as philosophy. Let me say also, there is no such thing as good or evil without God. The trying to conceive of good and evil without God is like trying to use a compass out in space. A compass is no good unless you're on Earth. A compass in space means nothing. So on religious, philosophical, legal grounds, we're all on solid ground. We should not be intimidated from influencing the government as Christians. Okay, I'm over time. Thank you for indulging me. The end of the sermon is traditionally set aside for people who feel a need to come forward. If you feel a need to come forward for any reason, this time is set aside for you as we stand up and sing this invitation song. Wherever you are, Jared, I cued you.